got back from my meeting with Emma Piercy and I'm going to chill out and then speak to Tim. I've learnt a lot about the supply chain and climate change, and I thought it would be a good idea to speak to a food security expert on what we can do to future-proof our food system. Of course, who better than Timothy Lang of City University? So, hi Tim, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thanks.
So, I wanted to talk a little bit about climate change and whether or not the weather influences how nutritious our food is.
Well, climate is obviously part of the natural infrastructure on which all food production and therefore consumption depends. There hasn't been that much research on the immediate impact of if a tomato has experienced 1 week of cold weather in 5 weeks of its ripening, whether that alters the nutrients or not. But we do know that how food is grown does shape the nutrient content. We also know species matter and varieties matter and so on. So actually total nutrient intake to consumers comes through many things that can be affected. But we know that climate change, to get to your question, is one of those big ones. It shapes what can be grown, where, and whether or not it's destroyed or comes to fruition.
What I've heard is in terms of as we're seeing climates rise in temperatures, we might be seeing flooding, which can introduce more toxins, issues like that. Can you tell me more about that and what sort of things we might start to see happening within our food and sort of the risks that we might have to start being more aware of?
We do know that climate change is becoming such a huge issue. It's reshaping our assumptions in many ways. It's reshaping what can be grown, but it's also reshaping things like when things go wrong. We know that floods can spread sewage if we're using rivers or channeled rivers to distribute sewage effluent. If there's excess flooding, well, those bacteria and viruses will spread onto land, which maybe was growing food. We know that food is basically part of ecosystems. We've tended to think, we rich Westerners, that somehow we've beaten nature. Actually, nature is biting back now. And science is showing us how that happens. It's not just viruses, sewage contamination, to use your example. It's zoonoses, this whole body of spread from animals to us. We humans have thought part of our taming of nature is taming and manipulating animals. And we're finding diseases spreading through from animals to us, but also spreading because we haven't taken the value of decentralized food systems. Instead, we've worshipped the globalization of food systems. So we've lowered our protection measures, essentially. And the food industry has helped drive that. I must be critical. Your remit, if you're from the food industry, has been to try and get food ever cheaper, and faster, and more through to consumers. And it's been a consumer bonanza. At one level, it's been a great success. It's what farmers were asked to do and the food industry was asked to do, learning the lessons of the terrible times of World War I and World War II, and particularly the economic crisis of the 1930s. But we're now learning this is all biting back. We've overstretched things. We've concentrated things too much. We've created rods to beat our own back. And one of the indicators of that is zoonoses. Another is the way in which climate change is threatening us in the very means of existence, namely food production.
So you mentioned, food prices there and the value of food. Compared with the likes of the US, Britain's food is much cheaper. How do we start to balance the cost of production with the cost of living? Surely I hear that farmers aren't being paid not nearly enough as actually what it takes to produce everything. And then we're obviously trying to get food as cheap as possible for people so that they're able to eat. How do we even balance this and square that circle?
I think it's a very good point that you've raised. To some extent, in my previous answer, I said how the drive of policymakers and indeed public demand was for the food industries to churn out food ever cheaper. Countries vary in how successful they are, but Britain has a particularly, now we'd say, bad record in this. From the 1840s, not 1940s, from the 1840s, political decisions were made to aim for not producing food from Britain, but to increasingly rely upon the empire as it then was. And it took First and Second World Wars, two wars, to dent that very naive policy. Uh, but we've now undertaken a different experiment, which is just to intensify production, both on the farm, in the factory, in the logistics system, in retailing, even in food service. Everything faster, cheaper. We're now realizing what we've done is externalize the costs. The full cost accounting, as it's called, studies are now showing huge externalized healthcare costs due to excess production of food, excess consumption of food, misallocation of food, wrong types of food, the rise of ultra processed foods, as we now call them, foods high in salt, sugar, and fat, is now dumping costs on the healthcare system. The National Health Service is not only being bankrupted, but brought to its knees by now a combination of diet-related disease and zoonosis diseases, COVID. We're seeing it before our eyes.
We are one of the richest economies. As you said, we've managed to put ourselves into rather a predicament. How did we get here? Are there any countries that are doing significantly better that we can learn from?
In a very interesting moment, 2007-8, when the banking crisis and commodity crisis doubled oil to over $100 a barrel, for example, and world food prices rocketed. There was a moment when the G8, as it then was, now G7, because Russia has been kicked out of it, i.e., the rich economies, and Britain is the sixth richest economy, declining but still very rich. When we began to say, holy Moses, we thought food was a problem for development or underdevelopment in Africa or in Asia or the Middle East or areas which were being hit by climate change. Suddenly, the rich Western world said, it's us. It's going to affect us. And it was a really interesting, very important moment of rethinking. And here in Britain, we contributed in a major way to that. Firstly, we started talking as active members then of the European Union with the rich Northern European countries and started to discuss this. And secondly, we in Britain started a very rapid process, a cabinet inquiry. I was involved in that, two strategy reports produced, and essentially, and then negotiated across the British food industry, food manufacturers, retailers, said, look, we've got to start shifting. We've got to start thinking differently about climate change, diet-related disease. We've got to reorient the British food system. And it culminated in a strategy known as Food 2030, that literally had reviewed, national food security through to diet, through to what advice do we give to consumers. It was signed off by the then Prime Minister, so top level approval by Gordon Brown in January, February 2010. Election a few months later, the Tories and Lib Dems came in, the Tories were in charge of DEFRA, they swept it all away, it was gone. So 13 years later, belatedly, Michael Gove started an inquiry into food, asked Henry Dimbleby, didn't do it through government, put it at arm's length to government. And then Dimbleby produces his two reports, ignored, swept away by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. So instead, we're in a drift, to be absolutely candid, we're in a drift situation. We still don't know what Great Britain, which has now left Europe, from which we get at least a third of our food. By value, it's more than that, as I'm sure you know. We don't know what we want. We don't know what we want from our farmers, except we want farmers to stop emitting greenhouse gases and to look after ecosystems. Great. I'm totally in favor of that. How can anyone not be in favor of that? But where's food in that? Where's food going to come from? Are we back to the 1840s approach, which is saying, well, let the empire produce for us? There's no empire, Bethan. There's no empire. It's called world trade. It's tricky. There's a geopolitics. China and other countries are much richer and can buy those food much more easily than we can. And we've got to rethink this terrible burden of diet on ill health as well as ecosystems. So we're in a bad place, to be absolutely honest. There would be moments, I'm always an optimist, there have been moments where we get there, and we did get there in 2010, and the food industry was on board with it. There were people kicking and screaming, don't let me romanticize it, but there was an agreement that this is the way we had to go. It went. That's politics, that's life. You know, people like me know about that history. The books behind me are full of examples of where changes and disruptions have occurred. But we're in a very serious position now, where with the Ukraine war, it's not yet a world war, it could tip into that. It could certainly be a really big European war. There are optimists who are saying, well, it's all sorted, you know, some grain is coming out of Ukraine, that's okay. It's not. The volatility is continuing. We're in a very tricky, risky, threatening situation. So I'm very sober and think we need to get a sort of it. And I think that's in the interest of the food industry. There are bits of the food industry who would agree with me and do now. They used to, but they do now. They know that we can't go on in business as usual because we're not in business as usual politics.
There's a lot of things there to unpack, Tim. I mean, in terms of food security, I've been learning over the last few weeks making this documentary that it encompasses so many different issues. You've just obviously raised quite a few there. How can we even begin to tackle them all, and tackle them equally?
Well, the critical issue is the we. You use that very important English word, we. It's not you and me, Bethan. We're not being asked. It actually ultimately has to be government. At the moment, part of my critique of current government thinking, and previous governments too, is that they've had a default policy that I call slightly tongue-in-cheek, leave it to Tesco et al. And leaving it all to Tesco et al. Means that government is not doing what only government can do, namely facilitate and shape discussion. We haven't got clear goals. We haven't got clear guidance. Government actually could be doing things. The sort of work I do is making suggestions of what could be done. We should have a national food council. The Nordics show us how to do this so that governments may come and go, but you've got a continuity of guidance and advice. We should be having an agreed framework in law about what we want from the food system. We should have sustainable dietary guidelines, not just what's good for human health or your baby's health, my health, family's health, whatever, but as a population, what's good for the climate, what's good for ecosystems. That requires thinking through. When scientists and academics like me have proposed that, and a few countries have tried it. Sweden did it, but then the European Union knocked it back and said it was encouraging people to eat local food and fresh foods in the summer from Sweden. And that was seen as anti the single market. Almost certainly that critique came forward, encouraged by the American meat lobby, encouraging Poland to complain about it. It becomes quite dirty politics, to be absolutely honest. But my point is there are things that we could be doing if government acted as a facilitator. And governments are frightened of food. They are happier to leave it to Tesco et al. But Tesco et al. Can't sort this out. Not even Walmart, not even Nestle, not even Coca-Cola, these giant corporations that straddle the world and dominate food supply chains. They can't sort this. We need frameworks. And those frameworks are partly given and beginning to emerge through at the UN global level through things like the Sustainable Development Goals, but they're a waste of space unless they're translated to national level. And we're struggling at that level. final point I'll make on this is that we've left the European Union nearly 7 years now, finally only 2 or 3 years ago. But meanwhile, the European Union, in its usual crab-like way, one step forward, two steps sideways, one step back, three steps forward, it's made a big leap forward. The farm to fork strategy, the Green Deal, is sending totally different signals throughout the European food system. It's now talking food system, not just the old common agricultural policy. This is about the food system, Bethan, not just agriculture. There is this reflex, you're seeing it in Parliament still today in Britain, of thinking, well, it's all just about farmers. Is it? Heck, it's about food to manufacturing, to logistics, to distribution, to retailing, to food service, to what the people eat, to the waste system. We can't even sort out a rational waste system in Britain. This is pathetic, actually. And we have no excuse now outside the European Union. We can't blame, as people have done, blame the European Union for meddling. Actually, the European Union is providing a fairly genial, slow, crab-like, I'm not that romantic about it, so I'm giving it a backhanded compliment, and I speak as someone who's worked inside it. But we're doing nothing. It's pathetic, frankly, and I really want the food industry to step up, actually. They've got to stop being cowardly and ducking these issues and start putting pressure on this government and the next government. I mean, we should be hammering Labour at the moment to get more specific. It's not being specific enough, and it should be. This is inexcusable while the drivers are worsening.
We are seeing some industry players, though, putting pressure on government. Do you think there needs to be more then?
Yeah,
And
it's
why
not
is it?
enough. Let me be very frank. Sorry to cut in. It's not enough. I've worked on this for 45, 50 years, and I'm pretty well versed across the sciences. I'm a policy analyst. I'm interested in what can policy do to translate the science into better practice. And also, I'm an ex-farmer. I used to farm. I know what it's like. Not totally, but 7 years, had a lot of experience. I have deep sympathy for people whose work is this, or working in a factory. I worked in a food factory for 4 months once. It's nothing for people who work their lives in it. But I understand there is a process of making decisions. We're ducking it. The pressure is not enough. It's too sectoral, to be absolutely honest, Bethan. I welcome, and I'm actually very touched by now meeting food manufacturers who actually wouldn't agree with people like me 10, 15, 20 years ago. But they do now about a lot of this.
Why
But
do you
the
think
trouble
that
is,
is, Tim?
because they're looking ahead and they think, holy Moses, we're not going to be in existence if this isn't sorted. And they're right. Absolutely right. Uh, the pressure that's coming from some big companies, I see it at the global level. We saw it, for example, in the UN Food Systems Summit, which occurred for one day. How ridiculous. But in that one day, in the preparation for it, lots of things went on. Lots of people got together, and lots of critics, some of them good colleagues and friends of mine, said, look, this is a corporate hijack. Big companies are now trying to take over what the global vision is. Actually, big companies are panicking because they don't see enough action. And some of them are not panicking. So I understand. I've long been a critic of food industries. It's too powerful, getting away with selling lousy foods dressed up to look like real food, unnecessary food, wasteful foods, and so on. But I recognize that there are some good intents and good thinking and honorable actions going on from surprising sources to people like me. I welcome that. And I think we're in a situation where policy will only develop through what I call unholy alliances. Holy alliances where all usual suspects get together. Lots of people like me all say, we should be doing something about this. It gets interesting if Tesco plus Unilever plus Confederation of Small Companies start saying, well, yeah, we got to address climate change and we need to reduce the embedded water in food. And we must have more organic and low impact diets. Well, that's interesting. That's not the usual suspects.
You mentioned earlier about government sort of focusing on farming and not really having a whole kind of viewpoint on I suppose the whole system when it
Yeah.
comes to the industry having, collaborators, people coming together and collaborating and putting pressure on. Do you think they need to come to the government with a solutions orientated approach and actually say to the government, this is what we need to do, rather than going, this is our problem, sort it out?
I think they're beginning to do what you're suggesting there already. We saw that in COVID. I was furious, frankly. Colleagues and I wrote an open letter to the then Prime Minister, one Boris Johnson, who of course didn't reply, but also wrote to the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and Head of Public Health England, saying, look, this in a crisis, one should really do a rethink. Instead, what was done was basically leave it to Tesco et al. A weekly council of war of the big food players occurred with the Secretary of State. That was wrong. It completely marginalized food service, which smashed 30% of the food system from consumers' point of view, and put out of business and wrecked long-term supply chains that food service had, for example. I will never forgive them for that. That was just stupid and wrong. So I'm worried about just food industry having a voice and saying, that's it, we are it. It's actually society that matters. I'm one who argues and have put a lot of my working life into supporting civil society. It's the public, stupid, actually, that matters in food. It's the public that riots. It's the public that eats. It's the public who has the ill health caused by diet. It's the public who funds the fat cats of business. I'm not happy if it's just sectoral food business. But do I want food business to be involved in discussing? Of course, they've got expertise. It would be crazy not to. It'd be stupid just to say, well, give food power to the Tim Langs et al. That would be bonkers. But that's why I said earlier, we need a Nordic type food council. We need to have a long-term, constant source of advice, like we got from the Climate Change Committee, from the Climate Change Act. Actually, there were some crazies on the right wing of the Tory party who wanted to get rid of that, but it would be too difficult and just completely loopy to undermine the future of the country to get rid of an act like that. And so you've seen the Climate Change Committee constantly coming out with saying, we've got to change what is produced on British farms. We've got to change diets. Why? Because the science says so. We might pretend it's not there. It's there. It's us, actually. We can't blame other people. It's us. We certainly can't blame the European Union, as Johnson et al. Did. It's us. It's
Tim,
Brexit. If
if
Brexit can't sort this out, the Brits are just a joke.
Tim, if you could be a leader for a day, what would be the first things that you change to make Britain more food secure?
I'd initiate a food resilience act in my book, Feeding Britain. For Penguin 2-3 years ago, I, in a very big section, spelt out what one reviewer said. There are 33 recommendations here. One of them was definitely, we've got to have a legislation. It's got to be put on a legislative framework. Secondly, you can't do that in a day, but you can begin that. Secondly, I would create cabinet subcommittee on food. Thirdly, you've got to have the ministers talking across. DEFRA is a weak and thin ministry. But unless the Treasury is engaged, unless BEIS or the new energy ministry is engaged, you've got to have cross-fertilization to deliver food, because food emerges everywhere. If you don't involve Department of Health and Social Care, you're not going to deal with this. So you've got to have some institutional reforms like that. And thirdly, I would really initiate very quickly a regional food decision making. We're being cack-handed. We've given a bit of power to Wales, a bit more power to Scotland, sometimes to Northern Ireland. England is all over the place. Let's break it and kick it and say, okay, 9 regions. of England. We want to have regional food committees, regional food strategies. Each of them's got to come up with how to increase horticulture. Each of them's got to come up with how to improve diet-related health. We've got to devolve a lot of this. It's not going to be resolved by Tesco et al. It's got to be bottom up as well. And some of that is very important strategically. For me, I called in my book, back to my first one, a Food Security and Resilience Act. I stand by that. I'm working at the moment on a report on how can we make the British food system more resilient. With almost no doubt, we have to decentralize it more. It's too centralized. If you want to be really scary, you just look at the impact that cyber warfare could have. Okay, the budget of the National Cybersecurity Agency was doubled. I actually asked for that in my book. I wouldn't claim any credit for it, but it's good that it did. But I'm not seeing much big change yet in food. We have major defense threats to the food system that frankly are not being taken seriously. And I'm writing a report about that at the moment.
Thank you so much, Tim. And when will that report be available?
I'll let you know.
Brilliant. Well, it's been great to have you, and thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Pleasure. Thank you for talking to me.
Well, that concludes my journey. Thank you so much for joining me this week as I ventured around the UK speaking with a variety of experts on the important topic of food security. And although my journey may have come to a close, food insecurity remains a big issue that we need to address head on. We heard from amazing experts this week about the ways in which we can address food insecurity, and I hope that these insights have proven useful to you. Thank you so much to RSSL for sponsoring and making this week possible. Until next time, goodbye.
We've got a very severe situation at the moment, particularly during the cost of living crisis, but we came into this crisis with really high levels of food insecurity before that. So we've made a bad situation now a lot worse.
But I think the biggest people I'd like to educate is politicians and civil servants, because I think there's a total disconnect between, how industry and the supply chain works and the understanding that our civil servants and our politicians have got of that supply chain. They can't really make decisions about what we're doing and how we're doing things if they don't understand it.
Feed raw material prices really rocketed. We also saw energy prices going in the same way. So from a cost point of view, pig producers have found things extremely difficult, and actually we will now see probably anything between a 15 and 20% reduction in the size of the UK pig herd.
We could have spent a lot of time moaning about what we have to do, but we focused on the task and made sure that we got the infrastructure to manage the task. And yes, it does take a lot more time and a lot more support to achieve the exports that we did prior to Brexit, but that is part of what the British consumer chose to do.
My generation probably have been brought up that that's always been available, whether it's been initially tinned and more recently, more technology to get fresh produce all around the world. We can have a fantastic array of, fresh, totally unseasonal produce. And I think we've just come to expect that. Our parents and grandparents would have eaten a more seasonal based diet where they where truly some products were a luxury at certain times of the year.
Right now, with challenges over the last 2-3 years, whether it's from Brexit, from COVID, and now dealing with the war in Ukraine, a lot of businesses are actually thinking about survival. So we need to be quite clever, I think, both as a trade association, but working with other stakeholders and getting those resources together for businesses.
We haven't got clear goals. We haven't got clear guidance. Government actually could be doing things. The sort of work I do is making suggestions of what could be done. We should have a national food council. The Nordics show us how to do this, so that governments may come and go, but you've got a continuity of guidance and advice.